Welcome to Workplace Psychology with Dr. Martha Greidick. I'm Dr. Martha Greidick. This podcast examines a wide variety of work-related issues through the lens of industrial and organizational psychology. And while many of the topics discussed here may be seen as intended for white-collar employees and their employers, in reality, the ideas presented here are applicable across organizations and industries. Additionally, many of the topics discussed here may be applicable outside of the workplace. I encourage you to examine what's presented here, apply what makes sense to you, and simply discard the rest. Most people understand the importance of good communications, especially when it comes to the workplace. Much of the focus when discussing good communication has been given to the speaking part. We want to make sure that we speak clearly, that we organize our ideas well so that we can be understood by those listening to us. But just as important as speaking is the listening part. After all, good communications are not limited to speaking only, but rather involve both sides of that coin, speaking and listening. You may have heard the term active listening. This is something that has been part of the world of psychology for a very long time. Both therapists and psychologists engage in active listening as a way of having good communications with those who seek out their help. But active listening is also just as beneficial for those seeking out therapy. After all, learning how to be a good active listener can be helpful to anybody in any area of life, and that, of course, includes the workplace. Being a good listener, an active listener, can benefit the person who is doing the listening. First and foremost, it can lower the chances of misunderstanding or being confused about what's being said because you're actually paying attention to what the speaker is saying. Not only do you improve your chances of understanding the speaker, but you're also showing respect to the person who is doing the speaking. But that's not the only benefit of active listening. The speaker benefits from this as well. Not only are they being shown respect, and that's something that, of course, is a benefit to anyone speaking, but they too can feel like they're being heard, they're being understood, and they are given the opportunity of clarify if there is something that needs to be clarified, because after all, the listener has an opportunity to ask for clarification if they're actually listening. It's not difficult to see that active listening is an important part of an overall good communication process. It's important to remember that active listening is not limited to in-person one-on-one exchanges. While that's important when we speak to someone one-on-one, face-to-face, active listening is just as important when we consider communications in groups, whether it's many people speaking to one another or one person speaking to a group of people, such as during a presentation. And that also includes in-person communication as well as virtual or remote communications. Think, for example, something like a Zoom call or even a phone call. So how do you make sure that your listening skills are at their best? The first thing to consider is that silence is golden. Sometimes it can be very tempting to fill in silent moments, But during a moment of silence, the speaker may simply be gathering his or her thoughts, or they may be pausing to make a point, to get the audience or the listener to reflect upon what was just communicated. So keep in mind that silence is not a bad thing, and don't feel like you have a responsibility to fill every silent moment with some kind of chatter. So remember, first and foremost, silence is golden. Of course, there is a difference between purposeful silence and silence that's associated with someone who finished making their point. Make sure you're paying attention, because if you're paying attention, you have a much better chance of being able to distinguish the difference between the two and understand when to stay silent yourself or when it's your time to speak. Give your full attention to the speaker, whether that means a one-on-one exchange, or when speaking with others in a group, or when listening to a presentation. Give your full attention. That means being in the moment, not thinking about your response or a rebuttal or an argument about what was being said. Truly pay attention to what is being communicated. And paying attention means just as much listening to the words as it means reading between the lines or understanding the message that is being conveyed. So there's a great deal to pay attention to. Something else to pay attention to when engaged in good listening practices is paying attention to the nonverbal cues. Now, you may be surprised that nonverbal cues means the nonverbal cues both from the speaker as well as from you. Just as the speaker communicates to the audience or to the listener, if it's a one-on-one exchange, with his or her nonverbal cues, such as body language, so too does the listener communicate back to the speaker with their own nonverbal cues, including body language. Pay attention to your own body and what message you are giving to the speaker with how you sit, your posture, how you conduct yourself, whether you're still or fidgety, whether you're sitting up straight and paying attention or slouched in your seat. That conveys a great deal of information that can be helpful or hurtful to the communication exchange. It's important to show empathy and to try to see or understand the speaker or what is being said and see things from their point of view. That doesn't mean that you have to agree with everything that the speaker is saying or necessarily understand everything that the speaker is saying the first time you're hearing it, but it does mean that you give them enough of your attention and enough of your respect that you are willing to show them empathy and see things and understand things from somebody else's point of view. After all, everybody has their own point of view, and sometimes those points of view are the same, sometimes they're not the same, but that's okay. This is what good communication is about, being able to give each other that benefit of the doubt and show each other empathy so that everyone feels comfortable expressing what they're communicating. Don't interrupt. Of course, this goes without saying, but you'd be surprised how many times people overlook that because they're so excited or anxious or determined to get their point of view across. And it's very disrupting to do that when it's not your term or your time to speak. Sometimes when we talk to someone one-on-one, it's easier to get your point across because in a good communication, you take turns speaking. But when you're in a group communicating, you may have to wait your turn. When you're in a presentation, you have to understand when is it appropriate to interrupt, such as with questions or when asking for clarification. Some presentations may invite the listeners to raise their hands and ask questions during the presentation, throughout the presentation, while other presentations may have time set aside at the end of the presentation or sometime in the middle of the presentation for questions and answers. So make sure you don't just randomly interrupt the other people. Not only is it disruptive to the communication process, it's just good manners. As I already mentioned in my previous point, make sure you take some time to ask clarifying questions whenever it is appropriate. Remember, don't interrupt during inappropriate times, but asking questions, asking the speaker to clarify what they mean is important. Not only does that show that you're listening and processing what they're saying, it also ensures that you really understand what they're saying. It allows you to receive the message as it was intended, and this allows the speaker to deliver their message in a way that is understood. We want to avoid misunderstandings as much as possible. Being able to reflect and paraphrase is an important part of a successful communication exchange. This allows you to ensure that you have a true understanding of the message that is being conveyed by the speaker, and it allows the speaker to see that you're paying attention and trying to understand them, and it allows them to clarify anything if there's a need to do that. So don't be shy to reflect, to show how you understand the message to be, what the meaning is. And one way of doing that is to rephrase things that you heard or paraphrase things that you heard. Do it in a respectful manner, meaning do it when the time is right. So if you are a listener of a presentation, if you're part of an audience, wait for the appropriate time, just as you would with questions. As you can see, active listening is not a complicated concept, or at least it doesn't have to be. It's relatively simple and straightforward. The only trick, if you can even call it that, is to actually employ the tips that I gave you here during this episode. But what's important to understand is that active listening is just as important as clear and proper way of communicating. It's a give and take. It takes those two parts, both speaking and listening. And while this is something that can be beneficial to everybody in any area of life, it can be especially important and helpful when we consider the workplace. Proper communication allows us to avoid misunderstandings, allows us to understand each other, and allows us to move forward with our tasks and projects in a way that will help us to be successful in what we do at work. As this episode comes to an end, let's review what was discussed. Communications is an important part of a successful day at the office. And while much effort and time has been dedicated to the consideration of the speaking part of communication, listening is just as important. In this episode, we talked about active listening, and active listening simply takes some practice and the engagement of a handful of concepts. Remember that silence is golden. Don't feel the need to fill in the gaps of silence simply because they make you feel uncomfortable. Allow the speaker to make a point or simply gather their thoughts. Make sure you're paying full attention. That means being in the moment and not thinking of a rebuttal, an answer, or an argument. Pay attention to nonverbal cues. That means nonverbal cues from the speaker to the audience, as well as your own nonverbal cues to whoever is speaking. Show empathy. Try to see things from the other person's point of view, or put yourselves in their situation or their shoes, and allow them to make a point without judging them or rejecting the point simply because that's not how you see things. Don't interrupt. Not only is that the polite way of conducting ourselves, but interrupting can throw off the speaker's part of the conversation exchange. Wait for the appropriate time, whether you're asking questions or have an answer or rebuttal or suggestion of your own. Make sure that you're giving the speaker their opportunity just as you would like your own opportunity to speak or ask questions. Remember to reflect and paraphrase as appropriate, and timing is key here, but it allows you to clarify and gain a better understanding of whatever the speaker is trying to communicate. So don't forget to use that skill to solidify the value of the communication, of the exchange that took place. As the week unfolds, I invite you to consider your own communication style and your own listening skills, especially active listening. And many people will probably answer that their active listening is pretty good, but you may be surprised if you were to seek out the feedback of others. So I encourage you to do that this week. Ask several people whose opinion you respect and trust, to give you some feedback on your listening skills, especially active listening, and hear what they're saying. Do you tend to interrupt? Do you tend to cut them off? Do you not allow people to finish their sentence or their point? And do you seem engaged and to be paying attention, or do you appear distracted? What kind of verbal cues are you giving off in a communication exchange when you're the listener? Those are the kinds of things that you want to learn about, and then take what you've learned from this episode and apply them to your own listening skills. This is just as important at work as it is in every other area of life. So I strongly encourage you to reflect upon your own communication skills, and especially your ability to be an active listener. For those of you who are experiencing this podcast in an audio-only version, I encourage you to check out my YouTube channel, where you can find the video version of the podcast. In addition to the video version of the podcast, my YouTube channel also contains videos that address stress management. The link for my YouTube channel is in the description below, so I invite you to check that out. Thank you for joining me today. Please subscribe to this podcast. I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Until then, I wish you joy and well-being.